Hello, everyone. This is Lejane from Global Green News, and joining me today is the Honorable Peter Bevan-Baker, the Green Party leader of Prince Edward Island and a member of the Legislative Assembly representing New Haven Rocky Point. Mr. Bevan-Baker, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Lejane. Thank you for inviting me.
To begin, would you like to tell people briefly about you and your path to becoming the leader of P.E.I. Green Party?
Sure. A path less traveled, I guess, and one that I never expected to walk down. I was a dentist for more than 30 years of my adult life and was peripherally involved in politics going back to the early 1990s, where I established a local organization of the federal Green Party at the time, where I was living, which was in Eastern Ontario, in Brockville, not far from Montreal, actually. And that's where I sort of got my feet wet in green politics. I had just, my wife and I had just had our first child. And that perspective of what is the world going to be like for my daughter 20, 30, 50 years from now was the real impetus for me. Not that I wasn't aware of the problems to start with, but it really focused my attention on the long-term challenges that she was going to face as an adult, and indeed she is facing as an adult, whether they be social or environmental or economic crises, all sort of accumulating. So I decided to establish a riding association of the Green Party, which just did not exist at the time. In fact, back then, and we're talking nearly 30 years ago now, there were very few local organizations of the Green Party. So I spoke to some friends in the community and we set it up, never imagining that I would actually end up being the person who, I initiated it, but I didn't ever think I'd be a candidate as representing that group. I asked everybody else on the group in the 1993 federal election if they would run, and they all, for very legitimate reasons, said no. So by default, I became the candidate in that election, against my sort of wishes, and certainly it was never my ambition to do that. And I found that I was actually well suited to it. I knew the issues fairly well. I've always been a comfortable public speaker. So to my surprise and delight, I sort of enjoyed my candidacy. And after that, by default, I became the candidate. I ran several times in Ontario, both provincially and federally. And then when my family moved to Prince Edward Island about 20 years ago, I sort of took it up here on Prince Edward Island, and again ran federally a couple of times for the Green Party, and provincially, eventually taking over from at that time provincial leader Sharon Labchuk as the leader of the party, by which time my children had either all completely fledged the nest, or were absolutely less dependent on me as a parent than they were when I started out in the 90s. And the next election after I became leader was the first time that and this was my 10th election as a Green Party candidate, the first one where I ever thought we might actually have a chance to win. And indeed we did, because a confluence of a variety of things, my standing in the community, all of the resources of the party coming together to target to win my district, a weak candidate, you know, a few things all came together that allowed me to win. So that's how I became both the leader of the party here provincially, and then ultimately the first Green Party member elected here on Prince Edward Island. Of course, since have been joined by a caucus of 8, and we now sit as the official opposition in the legislature, which is very exciting.
It is, and in 2019, there were a lot of firsts in Prince Edward Island. As you said, the first minority government, the first official opposition anywhere in Canada. So that makes me want to ask you about your point of view. How did the political environment in Prince Edward Island shift after your historic victory?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think the shift happened over the preceding few years. I sat as a single member here for 2.5 years, and then I was joined by Hannah Bell, a seat we won in a by-election in 2017. And that really showed islanders that the Green Party was not just a one-person organization. Hannah was a spectacularly good candidate and has gone on to become a spectacularly good member of the Legislative Assembly here. And that gave our party an opportunity to show islanders that we were well organized, that we had a depth of potential candidates waiting to come forward to put their name as potential MLAs, and that we were performing in the House, in the legislature. And of course, there's a certain amount of exposure which comes when you get into the legislature that does not exist when you don't have elected members. So Hannah and I had abilities essentially every day the House sat and any day in between to put the Green voice out there and show islanders that we have good ideas and policies on the full spectrum of political issues, whether that be healthcare or education or economics or social policy or transportation or whatever. And we sort of dispelled that myth that the Green Party is a single issue advocacy group on behalf of environmental issues. So those 2 or 3 years leading up to the last general election were pivotal in allowing us to elect the official opposition caucus that we did. Since we've become elected, I think that shift has moved from a place where we did absolutely influence the discussion and the tenor, the sort of atmosphere in the legislature, beyond that to actually being able to produce and come forward with our own pieces of legislation and to amend government pieces of legislation, because until very recently, we were sitting in a minority situation here. So the governing party had to take into account our opinions, our potential votes on issues. So we were able to influence significantly a number of pieces of legislation that came forward from government, as well as introduce our own pieces of legislation. So we're currently the only province, I think that's still true, with hard targets for carbon emissions and points along the way between now and 2050 to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. A lot of discussion on proactive healthcare, particularly in mental health. A lot of discussions on long-term solutions to big problems like poverty, like Indigenous reconciliation, like climate change. All of the big wicked problems that governments have tended to avoid the difficult conversations on. We have either initiated those conversations or made sure that they were part of the daily discussions in our legislature. So it's really changed both the nature of discussions, because our first motion was to end heckling in our legislature. So the whole tone of the place is entirely different. It's much more collegial, much more collaborative. But above that, the pieces of legislation and the issues that are being discussed front of mind are very much determined, if not determined, shaped by the presence of a Green caucus. So I guess the short answer to your question is that we have fundamentally changed the way that politics is performed here on Prince Edward Island.
And if you recall, what are some of the legislative victories that have resulted from having an official opposition?
Well, the one I just mentioned regarding targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions, we have had a number of bills regarding good governance. We have, probably no different from any other province, we've had issues with patronage, with corruption, with nepotism here on Prince Edward Island. And a lot of that sprung from the fact that we do not have a framework for good governance here, whether that be whistleblower protection, privacy, commissioner powers, oh my gosh, advertising standards for political parties, election financing rules for parties. All of those things did not exist when the Greens came to the legislature here. And all of them and more have received attention, including in most cases, so the ones I've just cited, legislative updates or brand new bills coming forward to provide the framework for accountability and transparency that just wasn't here. So good governance has been another issue. A lot of economic bills, interestingly, not something that the public generally associates with the Green Party, but our first bill that was passed actually was regarding creating a greater emphasis for cultural, supports here on Prince Edward Island and green energy supports. So this was, a groundbreaking bill at the time, and it's allowed the department here, which looks after investment in innovation like that, to place more emphasis and more focus, and therefore more money in arts and culture and also in green energy. So those are just a few examples of bills that we have brought forward and have passed in the House. We have, I think, 8 bills in total as opposition, which have passed in the last couple of years. Something that never happened on Prince Edward Island with an opposition party before. There were always, of course, majority situations, so the opposition sort of just sat back and waited for their time to be the governing party, at which point they could bring forward their own bills. Very unusual for an opposition to bring forward any private member's bill, never mind get them passed, never mind have 8 bills in a very short time. So yeah, we've had a lot of successes.
Well, the Green Party has always put power aside and focused on what's important to the public. So it is very good to see it in action as well,
yeah.
When there's an official opposition. Well, previously, the Green Party has been considered a small party in Canada and somewhat with limited influence. However, now within official opposition, the Greens and P.E.I. have a bigger and a more prominent role in the legislature. How has this rise to prominence affected the Green Party of P.E.I. in terms of the party's structure, membership, and policy process?
You're asking some great questions, because you're absolutely right. The Green Party, and we were no different from any other jurisdiction in Canada up until a few years ago. We were an emerging party. We were a fledgling party. And of course, we had a constitution, and we had bylaws, and we had a governing provincial council. But really, it was just a group of friends who would get together, mostly it was largely informal. And we had to change that. We had to recognize that there were big expectations of us, and we had to adjust accordingly. So we legislatively, we had to prove ourselves, I guess, if I can put it that way, to islanders, that we deserve to be here, and that the votes that you gave us, that we will treat them with care and respect, and we will be the elected legislative members that you had hoped we would be. So there are 2 sides to this. I guess there's an internal governance piece, and we have had to restructure our provincial council. There are now 11 members of provincial council, and it's a very formal body now that meets regularly, has, of course, a much larger budget to deal with than we ever did before. Our membership has increased dramatically. And so we had to formalize a lot of processes. We had to demonstrate that we are a mature, grown-up party worthy of the support of islanders, and also worthy of governing. We're, as the official opposition, we're essentially the government in waiting. And we had to not only earn the respect of islanders, but we have to continue to earn that. It's not a given. The other parties have been around for 180 years. They don't have to do anything to justify their existence here in the legislature. We had to prove ourselves, and we're having to continue to prove ourselves. And maybe after a certain amount of time, people will accept that, yes, the Green Party deserves to be here and has a solid place. But yeah, it's been a big transition. You asked about policy as well. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have a mechanism provincially to do that. And one of the founding principles of our Green Party, and it's true of, I think, most Green parties around the world, is grassroots participatory democracy. And I have to say that's one thing that we did not have the mechanism in place to be able to do that effectively when I first got elected here. It is in place now, and we are starting to see the first policy come up through the grassroots, and for us as legislators here to present that policy in the House. So that's something that we were a little slow off the ground on, and that upset some people, myself included, actually. It was all part of the sort of heady, enormously quick growth that we had from, a fledgling fringe party with no structure and no legislative experience to the official opposition with all of the responsibilities and expectations that come from that. And I think, without being in any way conceited, I think we have navigated that pathway very effectively. We have stumbled along the way, and politics is a difficult place to live and work. but I'm surrounded by good people with pure intentions, fantastic staff in our legislative office, and a really effective provincial council. So those sort of building blocks that are essential for an organization to function well and to be functional as opposed to dysfunctional, we have put them in place gradually, and all of the foundations are there for us to be here for a long time. And that hasn't happened by accident. That's been very intentional.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Let's talk about what is currently happening. There's an ongoing debate, on whether to lift the moratorium on high-capacity water wells on the island. Many industries and farmers are putting pressure on the government to lift these restrictions, while activists are concerned about the environmental risks of lifting the moratorium. What is the position of the P.E.I. Green Party regarding this environmental issue, and how are you going to protect P.E.I.'s water supply and avoid long-term implications?
You have touched on perhaps the most emblematic issue here on Prince Edward Island at the time, and I have to say I'm really impressed with the research that you've clearly done in order to ask the question in the way that you did. And it's emblematic not just of the time here on Prince Edward Island, but of the complexity of being the official opposition in a political environment where, in order to come forward with a position, you have to take into account all sorts of things. Some issues have 2 sides, some issues have 25 sides. And to come forward with a good, solid position that is in alignment with your founding values, that has clear, in this case, clear messages that are in alignment with the Green Party principles of, first and foremost, that we need to protect Mother Earth because nothing else matters if we don't have water and air and fertile soil, but also recognize the political lens through which you have to view everything. That's a bit of a context as to how, when you are an activist group outside of politics, having too much politics in your organization is not a good thing, because you lose your edge, you lose your single-minded, clear focus on what you're trying to accomplish. When you're in politics, too much activism can also be a problem. And I say that because you have to take into account the palatability of any position that you come forward, not just regarding high-capacity wells, but pick your issue. You have to be aware of how that is going to be perceived by the general public. Like it or not, the currency of politics is popularity. And if you are continuously coming forward with positions that are out of alignment significantly with public opinion, you're going to have a very short and difficult life in politics. Having said that, as I just iterated a minute ago, we are Green Party members. We have some very clear values and foundational principles on which we operate. And one of those is to live within our environmental limits. Clearly, with high capacity wells, there's a potential issue. We rely entirely on Prince Edward Island on groundwater for our drinking water and for everything else, all of the water that we require for everything that we do here, not just us, but the rest of the island, the rest of the species with which we share this province. It comes from groundwater. So we have to protect that. Currently, farming here on Prince Edward Island, there's been a moratorium on high capacity wells specifically related to agriculture, a moratorium that does not exist for other activities. For example, municipalities, there's no moratorium there. Golf courses, there is no moratorium on golf courses being built and accessing high capacity wells. So there's also an equity issue here. The position of the Green Party is that we do not have sufficient scientific data in order to condone the use of high capacity wells across our province. The watersheds, there are, oh my gosh, I want to say, I'm not going to say, I can't remember how many watersheds there are across our province, but there's a significant number of watersheds.
308, I believe.
Thank you. I was going to say 120, but you're probably right. Each of those is distinct and unique. it's entirely possible that one could place high capacity wells in a particular watershed and it not have a detrimental impact on the water table, on people's wells, in their homes, in rivers and streams and wetlands, and it wouldn't be an issue. However, there may be watersheds where a single high capacity well may have a devastating impact on the ecosystem and on people's access to fresh water for their homes. So we do not have that information currently. And a study is being proposed by a professor at the University of Prince Edward Island to gather that data so that we do have better information on whether, firstly, we can use high capacity wells without any long-term deleterious effects, and where that might be possible to do that. So I'm not trying to be evasive in my answer here, and I hope it's not coming across that way. If there's one thing I've discovered in politics, it's that everything is far more complicated than it first appears. And this is an example of that. It's not just a question of, well, are you in favor of lifting the moratorium on high capacity wells or not? That's too simplistic a question. You need to understand what the implications are for that, and that one high capacity well in location A may be entirely different in its impact from a high capacity well in location B or C or F. So we're a party that makes decisions based on evidence, and currently we don't have enough evidence, we feel, in order to make decisions. So we are in favor of maintaining the moratorium until we have better data, and then we would move forward on a case-by-case basis, monitoring it. Should we discover that high capacity wells would be able to be drilled in particular parts of the province without any impact, at least based on the data that we have continuous monitoring and be able to go back and reverse that decision should it become clear that that high capacity well was actually having a profound impact, or any impact actually, on other aspects of the ecosystem.
Certainly, and the climate change, actually, we're noticing the climate change currently, and we're still unsure of like the recharge rates of the wells as well. So definitely there must be a research to base any actions. In addition, there's the housing and the healthcare issues in P.E.I. that were two of the top issues that islanders faced. And in the beginning of this year, with the pandemic, islanders have surely suffered from economic issues as well. I'm just wondering, what is the Green Party doing now to address and fix these problems for islanders?
Again, you've touched on three of the really enormous, we call them wicked problems within our caucus. Housing here, and I think this is true. I have a daughter who lives in Montreal, and I'm aware of the housing situation there as well in terms of affordability. On Prince Edward Island here, partly because we're so small, so little changes in the economic structures here in terms of supply or demand can have magnified implications. And the housing market here has, the price of housing has gone up 30% in the last calendar year, an unprecedented rise. And because of some programs brought forward by previous administrations and ongoing with the current administration, programs called the Provincial Nominee Program. I think Quebec probably has a similar program. Certainly other provinces across the country manage provincial nominee programs, which are immigration programs to increase the population and bring diversity to your community. Both of which are certainly in Prince Edward Island's case, very welcome ideas. But the nature of the programs that were brought forward here created a situation where people would use Prince Edward Island as a passing through place rather than a final destination. So rather than growing the richness and the diversity of our communities by encouraging people to come here and stay and be integrated into our island community, many people, and I'm talking thousands of people, would use Prince Edward Island as really little more than an entry place and then a springboard to either Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or one of the bigger centers where they would eventually move. And that throughput of people had a profound impact on the housing market and on the commercial rental market here as well. So there was a huge, short-term rentals, by the way, is another big player here. Again, not unique to Prince Edward Island, but because of the scale of everything here, it's very easy for a small change to have a profound impact. About 2% of the buildings in downtown Charlottetown, where I'm sitting in my legislative office as I speak to you today, are now owned by people using them as short-term rentals through Airbnb or one of those platforms, and it's entirely unregulated here. So there are many, and that's a big problem. So there are many aspects to the housing crisis that exists on Prince Edward Island. You asked what we're doing about it. We came forward with a housing strategy which provided some solutions to government as to what we could do in terms of beginning the regulatory process for short-term rentals. Again, not the only factor here, but one of the factors, and also amending our immigration programs so that we encourage people like temporary foreign workers. We have 1,000 temporary foreign workers here at any one time on Prince Edward Island, to give them a pathway to permanent residency here, or skilled workers, rather than the investor program, which is the one I was describing, where if you have a certain amount of money, you can come here, but with no obligation to actually stay and become part of our community here. So that's goodness. I realize I'm giving you very long-winded answers to questions, but you've asked some really complicated questions here. I've only gone into the housing part of your question here. You also asked about health, and I can't even remember what the third one was. Do you want me to on them as well?
Healthcare and economics.
Right. So COVID and the impact on it on the economy has, as it has been everywhere, profound here. Prince Edward Island, more than any other province, relies on seasonal employment. Agriculture, fisheries, and tourism are the biggest three parts of our economy here, and all of them are profoundly impacted, particularly tourism. We have a disproportionate amount of our economy which is dependent on tourism, and so that's been a complete disaster this year. Whether or not that will be resurrected to a significant extent next year, nobody knows. But a number of businesses that did manage to make it through this year because of programs like CERB or the other programs that were available specifically to businesses may not be able to do that. We managed for 1 year, but are we going to be able to do that year upon year? It looks like next year may also be a really challenging year for tourism. So COVID has had a profound impact here, and I think in many ways PEI is particularly vulnerable to the effects of a pandemic because of the nature of the structure of our economy. So that will be an ongoing challenge. I don't have any solutions there for you. We, of course, are hopeful that the programs will continue, particularly the federally funded programs, but we also realize that that cannot go on indefinitely. And we will try and do, we have the Atlantic bubble here, which sort of helped a little bit, but really such a small percentage of our visitors here are from the immediate area that it didn't in any way shield us from the effects of the tourism collapse. Healthcare, as everywhere, access to healthcare is an issue. On Prince Edward Island, the demographics here are that we have a disproportionately aging population. We have more seniors here than most other provinces. We have a higher percentage of underlying chronic conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity. Those are all things which we have higher percentages of here in our population than elsewhere. So there are some pressures on our system which are perhaps even greater here than they are generally speaking across the country. Mental health is an enormous problem here. I read a report, François Legault the other day was talking about the increased mental stresses on Quebecers as a result of COVID. And of course, that's not peculiar or unique to Quebec. We have similar issues here on Prince Edward Island. At a time when the capacity of our system to help people with mental health crises has not been good. And I fear for what that will do to individual lives, to our community and to the healthcare system itself. And again, I have no particular solutions for any of that, Lojane, but it's an enormous problem, a real worrisome problem here. And the longer the impacts of the pandemic go on without any foundational solutions to the underlying issues which are causing people stress and anxiety, particularly on the financial side, you know, that employment being really very difficult to come by, and if you do have employment, how vulnerable that is for people who are small business owners, and we have thousands of small businesses across Prince Edward Island, many of them family owned. What is the future for them? All of these stresses inevitably build up in families and individuals. So I have no solutions for that, but I'm very fearful of what the long-term impacts will be for our community here.
Does the Green have a plan or vision for after the pandemic ends?
Absolutely, we do. You would be familiar with the federal party's program for post-COVID rebuilding. We started very early here, recognizing that, of course, this was a crisis and it was dreadful in so many ways, but that it was an opportunity to revisit some of the accepted norms of our economy and our society, and to start questioning whether we could do something very different. And I have to tell you that we're very far ahead, I believe, at least in terms of planning here on Prince Edward Island. The Premier put forward a recovery council. We can't think what it was called now. That's not the full name, but to which the Green Party made a substantial. We had a lot of input as individual members. All of the caucus members, who of course have critic roles in various departments, came forward with what they would like to see. And interestingly, the report that was brought forward by government from all of the consultation and all of the input that they had, basic income guarantee was the #1 suggestion. 4-day work week was one of the top 3 suggestions, and I'm struggling to think what the third one was, but I know that they both came directly from Green Party input, and in fact, motions that we have brought forward in the House here. Basic income guarantee passed unanimously in the House way back in 2015 when I was the sole member. A motion on 4-day work week was discussed in the last sitting. So I think there's an opportunity here for Prince Edward Island to really imagine something quite profoundly different from what we had before, in terms of what the economy and the society looks like. And going back to something I said earlier, the scale of Prince Edward Island lends itself to pilot projects and the ability to be nimble and to shift in a way that, you know, the larger provinces like Quebec and Ontario, it's very, very difficult to shift something as dramatic as the social, for example, social programs, and convert them into a basic income guarantee. That's something we can do, and I'm not saying it would be easy, but I'm saying it could be done relatively simply here compared to the other provinces. So I'm very hopeful that the Green Party plan, which again was articulated in all those submissions that we made as individual caucus members, and has been coalesced in our own plan, which no doubt will much of it will find its way into our next platform, depending on where the world is regarding COVID. But the P.E.I. could again be seen to be a leader when it comes to, as Mr. Trudeau says, building back better.
Thank you so much for that. For the last question, I want to get your point of view on Annamee's poll election. As you know, she made history by becoming the first Black Canadian and the first Jewish woman leader of a federal party in Canada. Just want to ask you, what do you think about her election, and how will it influence the Green Party movement in Canada?
I'm thrilled. I think Annamee is wonderful. I spoke to all of the leadership candidates in the run-up to the recent election. I didn't endorse anyone because it just didn't feel right as a prominent person and the leader of a provincial party to insert myself in the discussion. But I will say I'm absolutely thrilled that Annamee came through as our new leader. I don't know Annemie well. I have to be absolutely candid with you, but I had several long phone conversations with Annemie prior to the election. I think she is a woman of integrity and intelligence. I think she will bring the diversity to Canadian, not just to our own party, but to Canadian politics that we desperately need at the moment. That diversity of, well, in every way, of lived experience, of ethnicity, of life in general, of her work internationally, her work as a lawyer. All of these things, I think, mean that she will be an extraordinarily strong leader for our party and an extraordinarily useful attribute to Canadian politics. So I'm very excited about what Annemie will be able to do in terms of being the voice of our party federally. And I think, as happened here on Prince Edward Island, sometimes you need a confluence of events in order for a political party to suddenly flourish. And I think the arrival of Annemie Paul as our next leader is one of the building blocks that may allow the Green Party of Canada to have a similar sort of flourishing as we have enjoyed here on Prince Edward Island over the last couple of years.
I agree with you. Ms. Paul is a strong woman, and she has a very well-constructed vision for the future of our community. Mr. Bevan-Baker, thank you so much for your honest answers, and it was truly a pleasure talking to you today.
Oh, and the pleasure was mine also, Lejane. I appreciate the work you clearly done to have this discussion, and I wish you well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.